As tough Nietzscheans, we need to be tough on ourselves and tough on Nietzsche too. It shouldn't be all one way. We should criticize some ideas too. In fact, we should do that quite thoroughly. I came across one criticism amongst many in the books of G.K. Chesterton, writing in the early 20th century. He often took issue with Nietzsche on a variety of subjects, quite effectively too. For example, he looked at the issue of egoism, and he said something like this: Nietzsche is an egoist. Nietzsche preaches egoism. Therefore, Nietzsche cannot be an egoist. He must be an altruist. Because preaching is a giving something away. Preaching is looking towards the other, giving something to the other. Whereas egoism, in its purest sense, is everything for the self and only for the self. Now, it is true that Nietzsche praised selfishness. In terms of revaluing the Christian virtue of selflessness, he did, in fact, advocate selfishness. But that doesn't mean that he was purely an egoist. So therefore, Chesterton's assumption, the first assumption he makes, is not correct. He says Nietzsche is an egoist. I don't think that is quite correct. Now, if we look at Zarathustra, we see that it begins with Zarathustra going into his cave for 10 years, and there being in solitude. Therefore, we can see that as a symbol of egoism. Zarathustra is only with himself, for himself, in that period. He decides after 10 years to come down from the cave in the mountain and come amongst people, others. He does that in order to preach the doctrines that he will preach in Zarathustra. So one could say there that Chesterton is correct in that when Zarathustra descends the mountain and goes amongst people, he is no longer the egoist he was when he was in his cave. And that is acceptable. However, the doctrines he preaches in Zarathustra go far beyond any kind of egoism. The two main doctrines, the supermen and the eternal recurrence of the same, both those doctrines are impersonal doctrines. They are not based on the ego. Therefore, his teaching in Zarathustra is not a teaching of pure egoism. The doctrines which are most important in Zarathustra, the Superman and the eternal recurrence, are detached doctrines, detached from the self. They are not personal, purely egoistic doctrines. So, as with much criticism, if we look at the initial assumptions, we can find that often the assumptions are incorrect. So while Nietzsche has much in common with egoism, with Max Stirner, and the union of egoists who took Nietzsche up in the early 20th century, as they themselves recognized the union of egoists, he is not purely an egoistic philosopher. His philosophy of the eternal recurrence and the Superman, the very meat and bones of Zarathustra, are far beyond egoism. That insight that the Superman is a non-personal concept I found in the work of Colin Wilson, who is probably the only existentialist who is compatible with tough Nietzscheanism. So where the British common sense of Chesterton rails against Nietzsche and his egoism, he doesn't catch the nuance of Nietzsche's ideas. They are not purely egoistic. He is not purely an egoist. Wilson understands that, and he understands that the concept of the Superman is a very much a non-personal one, a detached one. Nietzsche gets his visitation, his inspiration for the eternal recurrence of the same, high on the mountains, thousands of feet above mankind, detached from mankind and petty egos.